Following tonight's lecture, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. And then at the conclusion of the discussion, you're all invited to attend a reception that will be held in the lobby, which is in the west part of the seminary complex. It is to your left as you exit, well, currently to your left. Well, it is a personal pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Michael Cromartie. Mr. Cromartie is Vice President at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., where he directs both the Evangelicals in Civic Life and the Religion and Media programs. Michael has deep roots in the Reformed tradition of the Christian faith. He is a graduate of Covenant College. His wife is a graduate of Calvin College. And he serves as an adjunct professor at the Reformed Theological Seminary. He is the editor of numerous books, including Religion and Politics in America, The Public Faith, Evangelicals and Civic Engagement, and Caesar's Coin Revisited, Christians and the Limits of Government. And he has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including NPR's All Things Considered, NBC's Evening News with Brian Williams, ABC's World News Tonight, and CNN, as well as having been quoted in numerous national and international newspapers and magazines. However, while all these facts and qualifications might lead one to invite Michael Cromartie to be an invited speaker at Calvin's campus, it is really in relationship to his work as serving on the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom, which prompts his invitation to deliver the 13th annual Paul Henry Lecture. In September of 2004, Mr. Cromartie was appointed by President Bush to a 4-year term on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. The Commission is a bipartisan federal body which assesses and proposes U.S. foreign policy action in order to advance freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Michael Cromartie currently serves as the Vice Chair of the Commission after having previously served as the Chair of the Commission. So, Michael Cromartie is well qualified to deliver the 13th annual Paul B. Henry Lecture. No final victories, no final defeats, doing our duty while living in exile. So please join with me in welcoming Michael Cromartie to Calvin.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Schmidt. Am I getting a little reverb? Just a little bit. It's wonderful to be here. I'm honored to be here. I jumped enthusiastically at the opportunity to be here because of my great admiration for Paul Henry. I even have my copy of Politics for Evangelicals marked up that I revisited before coming. And I like the size. It fits right in your back pocket. But I'd like to tell you at the beginning here just a little bit about how I first met Paul Henry. I had become friends with former Calvin professor of philosophy Richard Mouw and also with Professor Stephen Monsma. At the time, in 1977, I was working as a research assistant for Charles W. Colson. Now, many of you in the room will know who Charles Colson is, but there are a lot of younger people in the room who may have heard of something called Watergate. And Chuck Colson was a man who was involved in the Watergate, was a special counsel to Richard Nixon, and then he had a conversion experience and became a strong Christian after being indicted and going to prison. And I worked with Chuck Colson at the beginning of his prison ministry, and he was coming to Grand Rapids to speak. And I said, if you're coming to Grand Rapids, you've got to meet some Calvin faculty. And so Steve Monsma, we had lunch and a 4-hour discussion in Steve Monsma's living room with Nicholas Walterstorff, Richard Mouw, Steve Monsma, and Paul Henry. And that's where our friendship began. And Paul was his usual self that day. He was just clear, concise, and right on point. The better part of that occasion, though, was afterwards, and Paul said, could you come and speak in my class the next day? And when I found out my future wife was in the room, and his class, and that she didn't know at the time she was my future wife. It was my desire that she become my future wife. I leapt at that opportunity, and And it had a little bit of effect, I think, on her view of me, watching Professor Henry ask me questions about life in Washington. It was the beginning of a special friendship with Paul, and it meant a lot to me, and I know it meant a lot to Charles Colson. Now let me begin with this. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, wrote a famous essay that I would call to your attention called Politics as a Vocation. Politics as a Vocation. The essay was originally a lecture, and here's how he began. This lecture, which I give at your request, will necessarily disappoint you in a number of ways. You will naturally expect me to take a position on the actual problems of the day. But that would be the case only in a purely formal way, and toward the end, when I shall raise some questions concerning the significance of political action in the whole of life. In today's lecture, however, all questions that refer to what policy and what content one should give one's political activity must be eliminated. Now, he said, to our subject matter. End of quote. Thank you, Professor Weber. My sentiments exactly. And since this is a nonpartisan institute, perhaps I could begin with a nonpartisan story that I heard recently about two senators in Washington, D.C. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat. Just over a year ago, they were having lunch in the Senate dining room. The Republican said to this Democratic senator, you know, the problem with you Democrats is that you don't understand religion. You don't understand religious people. You don't know them. They don't vote for you. I mean, by the way, this was over a year ago. It was before the election. You don't vote for them. You don't know them. Why, I will bet you $20 that you can't even recite the Lord's Prayer. And the Democratic senator said, well, sure, the bet's on. He said, let's bow our heads. So he bowed his head and he said, now I lay me down to sleep. The Republican pulled out a $20 bill and gave it to him and said, I didn't think you could do it. Now, my title tonight is No Final Victories, No Final Defeats, Doing Our Duty While Living in Exile. And that story doesn't help you understand that we're in exile. You won't ever believe it. Here's the reason, however, for my title. I've been working in Washington on issues related to the intersection of religion and public life now for over 30 years, since 1976. And I've witnessed up close the presidencies of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bush 41, then the Clinton presidency, and then Bush 43, and now President Obama. And I have been in many meetings where activists, both conservative and liberal alike, have expressed deep disappointments over what they had hoped would be accomplished, and what in fact had not been achieved through the political process. These were people who were, after their candidate won, these were people who were utterly deflated. They thought the kingdom of God was coming in on Air Force One, and when it didn't happen, they were surprised. And by the way, you may have noticed, it didn't happen. This got me to thinking, what is going on here? What's going on here? It was then that I discovered the political realism of the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and soon quickly discovered that Niebuhr got his Christian realism from St. Augustine. So tonight in my concluding remarks, I want to argue for an evangelical appreciation of Niebuhr, or better yet, in fact, the need for a recovery of an Augustinian sensibility among those of us concerned about the shape and the issues surrounding our public policy concerns. One of the most difficult concepts for religiously motivated political activists to grasp on the political left and the political right is just 4 words. 4 words. Now, but not yet. Now, but not yet. Now, but not yet refers to the kingdom of God has entered this age, but the kingdom has not come yet. Keeping that in mind is very important as we go about our business of being faithful Christian citizens. Now, but not yet. And so, what kind of people ought we to be in this time, at this intersection of the ages? Well, I want to begin by giving you an example from Scripture. And my example might surprise you. From the book of Job, chapter 29, verses 7 and following. Job is reflecting and looking back over his life, and he says this. Job 29, verse 7. When I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me, and they stepped aside. And the old men refrained from speaking, and they covered their mouths with their hands. The voices of the nobles were hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. Whoever heard me speak spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me. Now, end of quote. Now, why did they respond this way to Job? I now give you verses 12 through 17. Because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist him. The man who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put righteousness on as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked, and I snatched the victims from their teeth. End of quote. What a life and what an example for us. Dr. Jean Bethke Elstein, a professor of Christian ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School, spoke at a conference I hosted several years ago on theology and political theory. At the end of her lecture, she reminded us of this. And she said, and I quote, "We should always remember that when we're dealing with politics, we're dealing with human bodies, with soft-shelled, fragile creatures that can bleed. With soft-shelled, fragile creatures that can bleed. She said, a mother in Argentina had lost all three of her children, all of whom had been tortured or had disappeared. And the mother said to Jean Elstein, what we have learned is that politics is about bodies and about bones. It's about bodies and about bones. End of quote. Now, many of the people I've met in my work on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom as a commissioner are people who suffer right now in their bodies and in their bones. And they are soft-shelled, fragile creatures that can bleed, and even now are doing so. In fact, the bleeding is continuing. Tonight as we meet, and many of those who are suffering are doing so because of their very strong commitment to their religious faith. Some of those who are suffering are Christian Pentecostals, others are Buddhist monks in Tibet, and still interestingly, others are Muslims who suffer under Islamic societies who have different understandings of how to interpret Sharia law. So I want to discuss that with you tonight. First, let's begin with some history. After the ravages of World War II, much of the world came together under the auspices of the United Nations, and they provided a voice for tolerance with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The Universal Declaration recognizes in its very first sentence the inherent dignity and equality, inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Article 18 of the Declaration forbids distinctions of any kind, including religion, with regard to the enjoyment of those rights and those freedoms. It states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. Now, of the 58 states in existence in 1948, not a single country voted against the Universal Declaration. The Declaration thus represented a consensus among people of all religious faiths on the subject of the fundamental human rights, and especially the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, fast forward nearly 50 years to 1998. In that year, with a similar consensus, the United States Congress passed a law entitled the International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA, I-R-F-A. The act, in near unanimous and bipartisan vote of both houses, passed, and President Bill Clinton signed the act. Now, the passage of IRFA, as it is often called, made the issues of religion, of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience an integral part of U.S. foreign policy. It made the promotion of religious freedom a basic aim of U.S. foreign policy, and the law is one of the most sweeping human rights statutes on record, and only and only one of its kind in the entire world. The creators of IRFA found that religious freedom is under renewed and in many cases increasing assault in many countries around the world, and that more than one half of the world's population lives in countries where the right to religious freedom is in some manner restricted as a result of government action or, as in some cases, government inaction. Therefore, one of the main purposes and principles behind the IRFA was to make the issue of religious freedom and religious belief an integral part of U.S. international human rights agenda in order to help address the egregious violations of freedom of religion worldwide. Because such a lack of freedom, when left unchecked, can ultimately result in atrocities on a wide scale: political imprisonment, disappearances, torture, killings, even genocide can be committed in the name of religion and with strong religious undercurrents. So it's important to recall that the cause of international religious freedom and the persecution of religious believers was barely a blip on the screens of foreign policy experts in the early 1990s. Now it enjoys increased diplomatic attention and notice, but it's not just receiving notice in diplomatic circles and in the halls of the State Department. It's now receiving notice in the mainstream press. In May 2002, the New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof noted that evangelical Christians had become the nation's new internationalists, saving lives in some of the most forgotten parts of the world. In October 2002, New York Times political reporter Elizabeth Buemiller wrote a front page above the fold story on how evangelical Christians were having a surprising influence on the Bush administration that was resulting in important human rights achievements. And Lori Goodstein, the religion reporter at the New York Times, observed that, quote, a wide swath of Americans who admit they never before paid much attention to foreign affairs or human rights is beginning to exert influence on American foreign policy around these issues. Now, evangelical leaders have been pressing for a greater priority for human rights, and they have come to embody, says Professor Alan Hertzke, a former Henry Institute lecturer. Professor Hertzke says evangelicals have come to embody what to many liberals and secularists might seem like a mind-bending prospect: evangelicals as a foreign policy conscience of conservatism. Professor Hertzke has written an important book called Freeing God's Children. It's the best book on the topic. And in it, he says that this faith-based movement is filling a void in human rights advocacy, raising issues previously slighted or insufficiently pressed by secular groups, the prestige press, and the foreign policy establishment. Now, how did this come about? Well, first of all, it should be recalled that the roots of evangelical engagement with some of these issues can be dated back to the Cold War, when organizations like Open Doors with Brother Andrew and also groups like Voice of the Martyrs kept many fellow Christians informed about the sufferings of Christians under communist rule. But in this post-Cold War era, we have come to discover more about the horrible cruelties that religious believers had suffered under tyrants all over the world, and not just in communist regimes. The past few decades are littered with examples of men and women suffering for their faith at the hands of authoritarian and tyrannical regimes in China, in North Korea, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Vietnam, in Sudan, and other places. In 1997, the late A.M. Rosenthal, formerly the executive editor of the New York Times, said this. He said, early this year I realized that in decades of reporting and writing and assigning stories on human rights, I rarely touched on one of the most important: political human rights, legal rights, civil rights, press rights. Emphatically, I did so often. But the right to worship where and how God would lead, or his conscience leads, I almost never touched the subject. Now, how can we explain this neglect, this blindness? Well, one reason would be what has been called a secular myopia, which can be described as an inability even to see, much less understand, the role of religion in human life. This myopia can be seen among our media elites, and it can be seen among our politicians. This kind of blindness is all the more inexcusable in light of what scholars like the late Samuel Huntington and Philip Jenkins, and in fact your own Joel Carpenter, have observed. There has been a resurgence of global religion and most particularly a Christian democratic revolution in the world. The historian Philip Jenkins argues that Christianity is today largely a non-Western faith. Christianity is today largely a non-Western faith. 60% of the world's Christians live in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. 60%. The most dramatic growth has been in Africa. There are more Presbyterians in Ghana than there are in Scotland. There are more Lutherans now worshiping in Africa than there are in America. Philip Jenkins says this: in 1900, about 1 in 10 Africans was a Christian, and there were about 100 million Africans. Today, almost every other African is a Christian, and Africa has more than 700 million people. That is dramatic growth. The average Christian in the world today is someone who lives in the Congo or in Brazil. We cannot begin to understand this new engagement with international human rights and religious freedom without appreciating this new reality. It was the ongoing reports of atrocities toward Christians in China and new reports of torture and enslavement and killings and genocide in Sudan, where 2 million people have been killed and 5 million displaced, that caused religious leaders to mobilize and to rally support for this legislation on international religious persecution. And I should add that it's not just Christians who've suffered under brutal, totalitarian regimes. Nearly 3/4 of Tibet's political prisoners are Buddhist monks and nuns. And by the way, we've been to Tibet, and to meet these Buddhist monks and nuns, and to think that any political leader would feel threatened by these meek people is stunning. In the mid-1990s, the government of China launched a patriotic education campaign designed to assimilate Tibetan Buddhists into the Chinese culture. Those who refused to renounce the Dalai Lama faced imprisonment, torture, beatings, and even were put to death. Now, as these kinds of atrocities came to be widely known, they prompted activists to encourage Congress to pass the International Religious Freedom Act. This new law designates an ambassador at large for international religious freedom to head up a new office at the State Department. It mandates that the State Department produce a comprehensive annual report on the status of religious freedom around the world. And this new law also created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, on which I am privileged to serve. Now, I'd like to quickly say something about the work of the Commission. The Commission recommends policies, it monitors violations. It tries in various ways to hold policymakers in the White House, in the State Department, and in Congress accountable to their response to this new information. The Commission is bipartisan. It's independent. It's an independent government entity. It is not a part of the State Department or the executive branch or Congress. It's funded by Congress, but it's not a part of it. The Commission is comprised of 9 private citizens who are appointed by the President and by the majority and minority leadership of both houses of Congress. And as commissioners, we travel abroad to gather research and hold public events and hearings, and we put out policy briefs and press statements and make recommendations to Congress and to the executive branch on positions that advance the international right of freedom of religion. And the Commission annually recommends countries to the Secretary of State to designate as what we call countries of particular concern. They're called CPCs, country of particular concern, and these are countries that have egregious, ongoing, and systematic abuses of religious freedom. Now, when I first went on the Commission and I learned about labeling a country a CPC, I wondered to myself, does it really matter? And as we traveled, it does matter. Their diplomatic staff is very concerned about not being labeled a country of particular concern by a commission of the United States. And, I was glad at least to think that all this work that we do on finding out facts on these countries is actually, it meant something. I met with one of the leaders of Bangladesh when I was chair, and as we were leaving, literally, to get in the van, he said to me, next time I'm in Washington, we'll go to dinner. I said, okay. And then he said, and take us off your damn list. I said, I'll think about it. But he knew about it. He knew a lot about it. The Commission also provides policy recommendations for each country that makes the CPC list, whether they want to know them or not. we make the recommendations. And then we issue an annual report that has a summary of the conditions in countries that have garnered Commission attention. So now, why does religious freedom matter in foreign affairs? Well, let me briefly give you two reasons why taking religion seriously in international affairs is important for U.S. national interests and global security. First of all, number one, religious freedom is universal in its importance and in its applicability. Freedom of religion and conscience is a foundational right of the post-World War II system of human rights. As I mentioned at the outset, in 1948, the United Nations issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In Article 18, it says, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his or her belief or their religion. This right, a person has the right to change their belief, either alone or in community with others, in the public or private, to manifest their religion or belief in teaching, practice, and observance. Now, this is very important, Article 18, because we're constantly being brought up when we visit these countries. They want to say, why are you here telling us? And we say, we're here reminding you that you signed on to these universal binding documents that have nothing to do with the United States. They have to do with the United Nations. Aren't you a signer of this? And they go, oh yeah, I guess we are. So it gives us some leverage. Again, out of the 58 countries then in existence, not one of them voted against the Universal Declaration. And so the Declaration represented a consensus at that moment in history on the subject of fundamental human rights, and especially the right of religious freedom. But then now, number two, more importantly, the promotion of religious freedom is linked to the promotion of other fundamental human rights and civil rights. Protecting religious freedom abroad is at the core of protecting basic human rights. The very practice of freedom of religion entails other human rights. The rights to assemble, freedom of speech, freedom to print literature, freedom to own church property. Governments that protect religious freedom for all their citizens are more likely to protect these other fundamental human rights. And as dissidents in China and Eastern Europe have argued, allowing freedom of religion for communities opens space in those communities for political dissidents and labor organizers and other human rights advocates. It can be argued that freedom for Jews in the Soviet Union represented the beginning of the end of the gulags. And freedom for Catholics in Poland was a key force in bringing down the Iron Curtain. Why is this? Because when religious communities gain more latitude to worship, cracks begin to develop in the walls that the communist systems and other totalitarian systems had built around other dissidents and courageous champions for human rights. Therefore, we want to encourage these cracks in the walls. It is always in our national security interest to promote and protect freedom of religion and conscience. We will be more secure, we as a nation will be more secure if we can get other states to stop abusing and jailing and killing their own citizens. Because states that repress religious freedom are more likely to pose a threat to their own security as well as to our security. Regimes and dictators that turn mercilessly on religious minorities are also those that will turn aggressively on their neighbors. There are intimate connections between persecution and genocide, between massive human rights abuses and regional instability. One has only to look at Sudan, or Rwanda, or Bosnia, or Kosovo, or even North Korea for the signs of this tendency. These conflicts are not explicitly religious wars, but we cannot understand these conflicts and the reasons behind them without taking the role of religion seriously. And if we don't, we cannot craft relevant policies to address these problems. And I believe, therefore, that the U.S. government reaffirms the promise of its own founding documents that all men and women are created equal when it speaks out on behalf of those who suffer and are persecuted for their beliefs. And of course, I also believe that we as Christians affirm the commands of our founding documents, namely the Scriptures, when we remember the least of these and the cries of the oppressed. Now, in this movement to call attention to the plight of religious believers who were and are being tortured and killed for their faith, there were people of various faith traditions who worked together for several years to help craft the International Religious Freedom Act. There were evangelical leaders, there were Jewish activists, there were Catholic bishops, there were human rights lawyers, They were not always in a lot of agreement, or did they not always have a lot of unity? And they certainly didn't agree on the presuppositions of why they cared about human rights. And some thought that the legislation was the wrong vehicle for change and that it was too blunt a tool to work effectively, and therefore it would be counterproductive. Some still believe this. And some argued that it did not take into account the importance of diplomacy. And some thought the bill only favored Christians and not other religious minorities. Some evangelicals even went so far as to say these policy concerns, about these concerns, that they argued that they agreed with the early church father, Tertullian, when he said, quote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And they suggested that helping Christians in such harsh governments and harsh environments was not the first duty of their fellow believers. Not the right person to quote after you've seen some of the atrocities that have occurred. Now, in the short time I've been on this commission, I've read and heard the stories and even met with some of the people who are our brothers and sisters who are suffering. And I've read and I've met some pastors who spent years in prison where they've been repeatedly interrogated, denied food and water, and sleep for days, and where they've been oftentimes whipped with metal cables. You hear of Christians who have fled for their lives from regimes that see religion as a threat to its hold on power. I met a Catholic archbishop in Sudan, in Khartoum, who told us of the death threats faced by those who convert from Islam to Christianity. I asked the archbishop, "What do you do when they try to join your church?" He said they don't. They flee the country. They flee the country. In a whimsical way, I said, "That probably hurts your church growth program, doesn't it?" And he, with a wink and a smile, said, "Yes, it does." But they flee the country. And by the way, they're not just fleeing the government. They're actually fleeing from relatives. They're fleeing from relatives. Or you read about a pastor who spent over 2 decades in Cuban jails, and yet he can testify about, quote, "the power and love of the Holy Spirit that sustained his missionary work despite excruciating torture." This pastor tells the story of being placed waist deep in a pool of raw sewage. But he said, God provided a sign, a fragrant blossom that bloomed during the entire night to overcome the stench. By the way, what kind of pastor do you think he might be? Probably Pentecostal? Sounds like it. And then there's Brother Kim and Sister Lee, who worked to penetrate North Korea, the worst country in all the earth, with the Christian message at great risk to their own lives. At great risk. In fact, Michael Young, a former member of our commission, an international human rights lawyer of some renown, now the president of the University of Utah, testified on Capitol Hill at a hearing of the Human Rights Caucus. And he said this: when refugees are forced back to North Korea, they are asked several questions, one of which is, "Are you a Christian?" And if they answer yes, they are then executed. They're executed. Now these stories, the stories of these fellow Christians, are inspiring and moving, and one has great admiration for their deep convictions, their courage, and their witness. In fact, one is convicted by their strong faith and their contentment under such circumstances, and their very deep walk with God. One can even feel that one's own life is really not significant compared to what one reads and hears of these modern-day martyrs. But that should not be the lesson we should take from these stories. What then should be our task? Well, part of our task is to make their suffering no longer a secret. Make their suffering no longer a secret. Inasmuch as possible, their cause can become our cause. Their lives and the plight is a witness to us. If we can shine a light on their stories, we can be their witness also. St. Augustine said in one of his sermons that, quote, God has many martyrs in secret. God has many martyrs in secret. And by that I take it that he meant that there are many strong, courageous Christians, even in our own communities, who despite much personal suffering and pain, also see the triumph of God's divine grace in their lives in situations that in the world's eye would appear to be hopeless. And I'm sure that God still has many martyrs in secret. But today, in many parts of the world, the secret is getting out. The secret is starting to get out. With God's help, we must do everything we can. Now, as a result of my involvement on this Religious Freedom Commission, what have been any lessons I've learned from this experience? Well, I've learned some valuable lessons. I have learned that working for political change and social justice often requires the patience of Job. Politics is, as the great German sociologist Max Weber once said, and I quote, a strong and slow boring of hard boards. A strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. End of quote. Politics also requires patience and persistence, prudent and principled compromise, because it is the art of the possible and not the reign of the saints. Over time, one learns through the hard knocks of battles fought and some victories won, but many disappointments beyond measure, that politics is, as Reinhold Niebuhr liked to say it, the method of finding proximate solutions to basically insoluble problems. The method of finding proximate solutions to insoluble problems. A quote, by the way, that I learned many years ago from Paul Henry. He always loved that quote. And what lessons would I share with my fellow brothers and sisters who are passionately concerned about human rights and social and political justice? The lesson is this. In order to maintain our sanity and emotional stability, when you see these horrors, we would do well to develop an Augustinian sensibility as we go about our important work. What do I mean? While affirming our responsibilities and obligations in the city of God, which is to come, we need to be reminded that we live in the city of man, where we have obligations and responsibilities, but we also need to be reminded our true home is the city of God, which has not come. We would do well to be reminded, as Jean Elshtain says in her book, Augustine and the Limitations of Politics, she says this, in this world of discontinuities and profound yearnings, of sometimes terrible necessities, a human being can yet strive to maintain or to create an order that approximates justice, to prevent the worst from happening, and to resist the seductive lure of imperial grandiosity. In this earthly city, we have our duties and we have our obligations, but we do well to remember that we will always be caught between what we fervently desire and our real-world possibilities. This will cause us, as the theologian Gilbert Meilander points out in his book on Augustine. By the way, I've been reading books on Augustine in preparation for this talk. Gilbert Meilander's wonderful book, published by Erdman's, The Way That Leads There, Augustinian's Reflections on the Christian Life, I warmly commend it to you. Meilander says this will cause us to be realists, but not cynics. Realists, but not cynics. What does this mean, to be a realist, but not a cynic? Here's Meilander again. He says, therefore, no return to paradise, no utopia, no end to friction and strife, no tone of surprise or outrage when politics turns out to be more complicated and less amenable to our ideals than we had imagined. The best we can hope for, and a mark of political wisdom, is that our divisions and disagreements be channeled and controlled in fruitful ways. End of quote. According to Meilander, this will cause us to have a chastened view of politics, but not a denuded view of politics. A chastened view, but not a denuded view. Now, we can talk about in the Q&A what I mean by that, but I want to underline that because there are some people who become so chastened they say politics is not important. Perhaps even some of your previous speakers have emphasized this point. I want to go on record and say I totally disagree, and I'll explain what I mean during the Q&A. But we should have a chastened view of politics, but not a totally denuded one. Because we live in this age between the two cities, there will be no final victories, but no final defeats either. According to the prophet Jeremiah, we live in exile, and we are to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Jeremiah 29, verse 7. Let me read it. Let me say it again. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. We are still in exile. It is more than obvious that we are far short of the kingdom of God. But on this near side of the kingdom, we are called to be wise, and to be faithful, and to be loving, and to be caring, and to be just, and to be as prudent as we can be by God's grace. Our task then is to work for justice, but also to be patient, and along the way carry out our duties faithfully, even while living in exile. Thank you very much.